Okay, so in the last talk, we looked at some of the ways that loneliness and feelings of disconnection can cause political problems, and some of the ways that we as changemakers can fail to build belonging through our work. What about the positive side of the equation? What about some of the ways in which we can build belonging? How do we do that? And what happens when we manage to pull that off? Well, as we did last week, we're going to be breaking this down into three levels. The I level, the kind of work that we might need to do individually in our own lives and our own work. The we level, which is all about relationships. And then the world level, which is really about our role as change makers and the work that we do. And I'm going to start this week with the we level, because, of course, when we think of belonging, it's a social concept. It's something that's almost by definition about our relation with other people. And I want to start by talking about an idea that sociologists call primary groups. Now, primary groups are small, informal, face-to-face, things like a family group, for example, or a close-knit group of friends. And they're different from secondary groups, which are things like a group of colleagues in an office or a group of students at a university, where it's a much larger group and it's more formal. It's kind of based on self-interest rather than affection. And it's more kind of about rules and rational thought. Now, the thing about primary groups, those small face-to-face tight-knit groups, is that they breed loyalty like almost nothing else. They're an absolutely fantastic environment for belonging to take root. And that's one reason why all through the ages, armies have organized themselves into platoon-sized units, because that sense of belonging, of loyalty, is what soldiers often report that they fight for, more than the kind of more abstract notions of kind of flag or ideals. They fight for each other. This is something that's consistently reported. And you can see here in this army recruitment campaign that it's actually now part of the sales pitch for why they want people, for why people might want to join the army. It's also often why religious congregations hold together. So here, for example, is a Quaker meeting for worship. And again, religious groups are held together by these ties of loyalty. That sense of connection, of community, is a big part of what keeps people turning up. And the thing is that change-making can tap into this as well. So if you look, for example, at a movement like 350.org, a big climate movement started in the US, then went global, it was really rooted on college campuses, because there you have these kind of dense networks of belonging and relationship, very fertile soil for kind of campaigning groups to grow from. Now, the beauty of this is that when you manage to construct these small groups at local level with those dense networks of kind of relationship and loyalty, it translates very easily to aggregating into larger movements. So if you look, for example, at the movement of school strikers, the Fridays for Future movement, just like 350, that was rooted in educational organizations, in kind of schools and the groups of friends within them. That was a big part of what made the movement spread so successfully, because it used those networks of friends as its kind of carrier. Another great example of this is how Obama, in his first campaign to be president back in 2008, was very successful in building, again, a national network built out of small groups. And those small groups cohered all the way through the election campaign, were a huge part of the mobilization that brought him to victory. But there's also a kind of cautionary tale here, because then once Obama was in office, his administration really failed to keep those groups going, to kind of regard them as a resource that it could continue to work with. And as a result, a lot of those small groups withered, leaving members feeling really disenchanted, and according to some analyses later on, contributing to some of the disaffection that led to the rise of Trump. Those small groups can also be incredibly important in movements that grow out of faith. So if you look, for example, at the Jubilee 2000 coalition that fought very successfully for developing world debt relief around 25 years ago, that was really built particularly out of the small groups of religious congregations that were the kind of the bedrock, if you like, of groups like Christian Aid and CAFOD. And they were able to kind of mobilize people at demonstrations like this more effectively, actually, than some of the big mass memberships like Oxfam that might have had more members, but didn't have those small groups that created the belonging and the loyalty, and therefore the kind of supporters that could be deployed out onto the street. And this was something that was also understood very well in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, that just like Jubilee 2000 was really built out of kind of church groups and those like bonds of affiliation at that very local place-based level. So finally, what about the I level? Because as I said at the beginning, when we think of belonging, we tend to think of it as a social idea, something that's by definition about our relationship with other people. But actually, belonging is something that very much starts in ourselves. And I want to talk for a moment here about the idea of shame, a really important psychological concept. Now, shame refers to the feeling we have when we think that we're in some way unworthy or unacceptable in society's eyes, something that psychologists often describe as a wound of belonging. It's something that can start early in life, for example, because of how we're treated by parents or educators or faith leaders. But once we have these wounds of belonging, they can live on inside us for our whole lives, potentially with very debilitating impacts. And again, going back to what I was talking about in the last talk, those impacts can create a kind of lasting psychological harm that can lead to political extremism. Psychologists sometimes talk about how shame wounds can lead to what they describe as a self-protective rage, where that sense of hurt inside us becomes externalized onto people outside of us, who we in effect scapegoat for things that nevertheless begin life as feelings felt in ourselves. It's something we can see very clearly with incels, for example, who really fetishize that sense of unworthiness in society's eyes, but then go and kind of act out from that self-protective rage. So in terms of being the change that we want to be in the world, self-compassion is really, really important. As RuPaul here, the host of RuPaul's Drag Race, puts it, if you don't love yourself, how in the hell are you going to love somebody else? And that's why if you study Buddhist meditation, for example, one of the very first practices that gets taught is the metta bhavana, the practice of compassion, of loving kindness. And when you do that meditation practice, it starts with self-compassion before moving on to compassion for other people, whether those are people close to you or people you find difficult, because it's understood that compassion is something that starts in one's attitude to oneself. And so belonging is very much something that does start with that inner personal work of self-compassion. And we've got some resources linked to that in this week's materials.